The Persian Gulf shimmered beneath the unforgiving blaze of the July sun. Heat rippled across the horizon, blurring the divide between sea and sky. The waters, seemingly calm, were anything but safe. Beneath the surface, beneath the hum of diesel engines and the rhythmic churn of ship wakes, there was a tension. A palpable electricity that vibrated through the hulls of every vessel passing through the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow corridor, just 21 nautical miles wide at its slimmest point, was and remains one of the most vital arteries in the global economy. A fifth of the world's crude oil passed through it, aboard supertankers bound for ports in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. But on July 10, 2019, that artery threatened to close, not from nature or accident, but from the sharp teeth of geopolitics. That morning, the British-flagged oil tanker British Heritage, operated by energy giant BP, cut through the Gulf's waters like a steel leviathan. Her cargo tanks were heavy with crude. Her bridge, high above the waves, was manned by officers scanning the sea and monitoring instruments, wary of threats that could emerge from any direction. In most times, such a voyage would be routine, standard passage through international waters under the security of peacetime maritime law. But these were not ordinary times. In the distance, shadows followed her, gray, watchful, and armed. HMS Montrose, F236, a Type 23 Duke-class frigate of the Royal Navy, moved silently alongside her charge. She was not new, nor the most modern in Britain's fleet. Commissioned in the mid-1990s, she was a veteran of many patrols, built for anti-submarine warfare, but versatile enough for any surface combat engagement. On this day, she was the guardian of the British Heritage. Her radar arrays swept the Gulf in endless rotations. Her Sea Scepter missile system and 4.5-inch Mark 8 naval gun stood at the ready. Unknown to many on board both vessels and to much of the watching world, this day was destined to become a moment of modern naval legacy. A flashpoint in the simmering hostilities between Iran and the West, forged not only in words and politics, but in the tangible movements of hulls and warships. To understand why the British Heritage was escorted by a Royal Navy frigate, why Iran was poised to intercept a civilian tanker, and why warships prowled these ancient waters once more, we must look to the months preceding this quiet July morning. The seeds of confrontation were sown in 2018, when the United States, under the Trump administration, unilaterally withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Sanctions were reimposed, strangling Iran's economy, especially its oil exports. The Iranian regime, increasingly cornered, sought to project strength and retaliate against what it saw as economic warfare. By mid-2019, tit-for-tat actions were escalating. Tankers were sabotaged off the coast of the UAE. Drones were downed. Rhetoric became more heated. But the most direct spark came in early July when British Royal Marines, acting on intelligence and at the request of the United States, boarded and detained the Iranian oil tanker Grace 1 off the coast of Gibraltar. The vessel was suspected of transporting crude to Syria in violation of European Union sanctions. Iran was outraged. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, threatened retaliation. The message was clear. If Iranian vessels could be seized, so too could Western ships. The Strait of Hormuz became the stage for the next act in an unfolding drama. And so it was that British Heritage found herself with a naval escort as she began her journey out of the Gulf. The risk was not theoretical. Just days earlier, another British tanker, Pacific Voyager, had been shadowed by Iranian boats. The Royal Navy knew the playbook. They expected Iran to act. HMS Montrose was placed in position, tasked with the unenviable duty of threading the narrow, heavily surveilled corridor of Hormuz with one eye on the sea and the other on the shadows beyond the horizon. At 4:30 p.m. local time on July 10th, radar screens aboard Montrose came alive. A cluster of small contacts, fast, agile, and closing rapidly, appeared to the northeast. They were unmistakable. IRGC Navy speedboats, likely armed and moving with purpose. On board the British warship, alert levels shifted. The bridge crew prepared for a confrontation. The frigate's weapon systems were brought to standby. Communication channels lit up. The Iranian vessels, 5 in total, approached at speed. Their intentions were soon clear. They attempted to divert the British heritage into Iranian territorial waters. A direct seizure attempt. The tanker's captain was ordered via radio to change course. The Iranians were challenging international norms, testing the resolve of the Royal Navy. But the answer was swift. From the deck of HMS Montrose, a warning was issued. Any attempt to divert or seize the vessel would be met with force. The British frigate altered her heading, positioning herself between the Iranian boats and the oil tanker. Her guns locked on. Her crew stood ready at action stations. A British Wildcat helicopter, launched earlier, buzzed overhead, tracking the small boats and relaying targeting data to the frigate below. The confrontation reached its peak. The Iranian boats, realizing they were outgunned and that the Royal Navy was willing to escalate, peeled away. The British heritage sailed on, untouched. No shots were fired. No lives were lost. But the message resounded across the world. The Strait of Hormuz was a flashpoint. One wrong move, and the balance could tip into open war. Later that evening, the British government confirmed the incident. Officials praised the professionalism of HMS Montrose's crew. In Tehran, state media denied that any such attempt had been made. But the signal was received in every naval command center from London to Washington to Riyadh. This was not the end, but a sign of what was to come. Days later, the warning would prove prescient, when another British tanker, Stena Impero, was seized by Iranian forces in retaliation for Grace 1. But on July 10th, the Royal Navy had stood firm. Outnumbered, outmaneuvered, but not outwilled. In that narrow waterway where east meets west, where ancient empires once clashed and modern power still flows like oil through a pipeline, an aging warship had drawn a line in the sea and dared anyone to cross it. The Mediterranean sun rose over the Rock of Gibraltar, casting long shadows over the narrow strait where Europe meets Africa. On the morning of July 4, 2019, British Royal Marines, operating with surgical precision, descended from helicopters onto the deck of a massive oil tanker. The vessel in question was the Grace 1, a 330-meter-long Iranian supertanker flying a Panamanian flag but carrying crude oil allegedly destined for Syria. Intelligence suggested that the cargo was meant for the Baniaz refinery, a facility under European Union sanctions due to its ties to the Assad regime. The Royal Marines acted swiftly, securing the bridge and taking control of the vessel without incident. It was a textbook interdiction. No shots fired, no injuries. But the consequences would reverberate far beyond the Strait of Gibraltar. To the British government, the seizure was a legal enforcement action, executed under international maritime law and in accordance with EU sanctions. Officials in London emphasized the rule of law, the neutrality of the location, and the intelligence underpinning the mission. The United Kingdom was not at war with Iran, they stressed. This was not a political maneuver. This was law enforcement at sea. But Tehran saw it differently. To Iran's leadership, Grace 1's seizure was an unmistakable provocation, an act of aggression dressed in diplomatic robes. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, ever vigilant for signs of Western duplicity, viewed the British action not as a neutral enforcement of international law, but as a calculated move aligned with Washington's campaign of maximum pressure. The United States, after all, had unilaterally withdrawn from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018 and reimposed crippling sanctions on the Islamic Republic. The capture of Grace 1 was, to Iranian eyes, a continuation of this economic siege. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, already on high alert, interpreted the operation as a humiliation, a direct challenge to Iran's sovereignty and economic lifeblood. Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif denounced the act as piracy. Iran's ambassador to the United Nations demanded the immediate release of the tanker. Behind closed doors in Tehran, retaliation was being planned. If Britain does not release the Iranian oil tanker, it is their ships that will face consequences, warned Major General Mohammad Bagheri, Chief of Staff of the Iranian Armed Forces. It was not a bluff. Across the Gulf in London, alarm bells rang in the corridors of power. The seizure of Grace I, though executed cleanly and within legal bounds, had ignited a firestorm of strategic risk. Britain's presence in the Persian Gulf was limited, and the Royal Navy's resources were stretched thin after years of budgetary strain. Still, London knew what would come next. Iran would not let this pass unanswered. The Strait of Hormuz, already a tension-filled choke point, now took on the character of a tinderbox. British oil tankers, previously anonymous participants in the global economy, suddenly became high-value targets. Intelligence indicated increased chatter among IRGC Navy units. Drone overflights of commercial shipping increased. Fast attack craft were spotted in greater numbers. The temperature was rising. In the Ministry of Defense, planners scrambled to mitigate the threat. An urgent decision was made. British-flagged commercial vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz would receive naval escorts. The Type 23 frigate HMS Montrose, already deployed in the region, was tasked with this high-stakes mission. Her orders were simple, yet daunting: protect British shipping at all costs. The Royal Navy, though stretched thin, began to surge its presence into the Gulf. HMS Duncan, a Type 45 destroyer, was ordered to reinforce Montrose. Additional assets from Allied navies, including the U.S. Navy, were placed on heightened alert. A coalition effort, informally dubbed Operation Sentinel, began to take shape to ensure the freedom of navigation through the vital sea lanes of the Gulf. The strategic implications were enormous. The Strait of Hormuz, just 21 miles wide at its narrowest, was now being watched by every satellite, drone, and radar station in the region. Every movement of a commercial tanker, every ripple of a fast-moving boat became an object of scrutiny. The waters of the Gulf, long a theater of veiled conflict, were rapidly militarizing. For the crew of HMS Montrose, the mission was clear. But the dangers were real. Every escort operation became a potential combat scenario. The ship's radar operators and lookouts worked around the clock, scanning for signs of approaching Iranian boats. Onboard weapons were kept ready. Communication drills were constant. The narrowness of the strait offered little room for maneuver, and even less for error. The seizure of Grace I had done more than halt a single shipment of crude oil. It had shifted the balance of tension in the Gulf. It had reawakened the ghosts of past confrontations, the tanker wars of the 1980s, the mining of the USS Samuel B. Roberts, the downing of Iran Air Flight 655. In Tehran and London, in Washington and Riyadh, old fears stirred with new urgency. And the Iranians did not wait long to strike back. Even as HMS Montrose completed her first escort missions under the new directive, Iranian boats began probing, testing the resolve of the Royal Navy. Radio warnings crackled. Fast attack boats approached tankers, demanding course changes. The Royal Navy responded with calm authority, but with growing concern. Iran was not finished. On July 10th, just 6 days after the seizure of Grace I, the tension finally snapped. Iranian IRGC vessels attempted to seize the British Heritage, a BP oil tanker sailing with Montrose as her guardian. The Royal Navy acted decisively, placing itself between the Iranian boats and the tanker, issuing clear threats over open channels. The confrontation ended without violence, but the message was unmistakable. The seas were no longer safe, and this was only the beginning. In the weeks that followed, Iran would retaliate directly by capturing the British-flagged Stena Impero, storming it with commandos and redirecting it to Bandar Abbas. The world watched in real time as a geopolitical crisis unfolded in one of the most volatile regions on Earth. The Royal Navy, outnumbered but resolute, stood as the thin gray line between chaos and control. What began as a legal interdiction had triggered a maritime showdown, one that would redefine the geopolitics of the Gulf and test the endurance of British resolve under fire. The surface of the Persian Gulf shimmered with oppressive heat as HMS Montrose, a Type 23 Duke-class frigate, cut a steady course through the sweltering sea. She was an aging but capable warship, sleek, bristling with sensors and weapons, and manned by a crew whose resolve was sharpened by experience and tension. Stationed far from home, based out of the UK's permanent support facility in Bahrain, Montrose had become the Royal Navy's eyes and sword in a region teetering on the edge of confrontation. Commissioned in 1994, HMS Montrose had seen her share of operations. But in the summer of 2019, she was thrust into a geopolitical crucible. Her primary task, to guard British-flagged merchant vessels against Iranian reprisals in the wake of the seizure of the Grace 1 supertanker off Gibraltar. The warning signs were clear. Iran was angry, emboldened, and preparing a response. British shipping was now a target, and Montrose was the lone warship patrolling some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. Under the command of Commander William King, a seasoned officer known for his calm under pressure, Montrose was already engaged in routine patrols when the call came in. A British-owned oil tanker, the British Heritage, was making her way through the northern Gulf, en route to the Strait of Hormuz, and onward to open waters. She was flagged under the UK, loaded with petroleum products, and operating in a zone now thick with political and military tension. Intelligence identified her as a high-value target. Iranian IRGC units were reportedly monitoring her movements. The risk of interception was real. A decision was made at the highest levels. Montrose would shadow the British Heritage, offering a visible armed escort as the tanker transited the Strait of Hormuz. The strait itself is a natural choke point of immense strategic value, only 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest, with inbound and outbound traffic lanes squeezed between the territorial waters of Iran to the north and Oman to the south. Though governed by international law allowing for innocent passage, the practical reality was far more volatile. Iranian naval forces operated aggressively within their declared territorial limits, often challenging passing vessels, especially those flying Western flags. Any encounter here had the potential to spiral into an international crisis, or war. As British Heritage approached the entrance to the strait, her crew was already on edge. Communications channels buzzed with chatter, warnings from nearby tankers, reports of Iranian small boat activity, and encrypted updates from naval intelligence. Somewhere on the horizon, invisible but very real, fast attack craft and armed speedboats of the IRGC waited, scanning the shipping lanes with hostile eyes. HMS Montrose, painted in dull gray and scanning with her Type 997 Artisan radar, powered forward to intercept and link up with the tanker. The ship's Sea Scepter missiles sat armed in their vertical silos. Harpoon anti-ship missiles were slung quietly along the decks. Her 4.5-inch Mark 8 naval gun, capable of hurling high-explosive rounds miles out to sea, was ready to fire on a moment's notice. And below decks, Royal Marines were on standby for boarding or combat. Montrose was built for this, escort and protection. But she was also alone. As the two ships drew near, Montrose took station astern and to starboard of the tanker, positioned to interdict any potential threat approaching from Iranian waters. In naval terms, she was now the Heritage's guardian, a knight flanking a royal carriage along a hostile road. Then, just as expected, the threat materialized. Iranian radio frequencies lit up with challenges. A nearby Iranian naval vessel demanded that British Heritage alter her course and enter Iranian waters. Over the VHF channels, the voice was stern, unmistakable, and unmistakably IRGC. Change your course. You are being ordered to stop and redirect for inspection. It was a thinly veiled attempt at seizure, a move designed to mirror the British operation against Grace 1. It was also a direct challenge to the Royal Navy. Commander King acted with precision. Montrose's bridge crew transmitted a firm and clear warning to the Iranian boats. Any attempt to divert British Heritage would be met with force. A targeting radar locked briefly onto one of the approaching craft, a quiet but unmistakable signal that the Royal Navy was not bluffing. The crew went to action stations. Damage control teams stood ready. Weapons crews moved to full readiness. On the deck, sailors took up positions behind mounted machine guns. The tension aboard was palpable. Engines rumbled. Radios crackled. Time slowed. The IRGC boats, outgunned and outmaneuvered, hesitated. Then slowly they began to withdraw. The British Heritage continued her journey, undisturbed but deeply shaken. A confrontation had been averted, not through luck, but through readiness and resolve. The encounter was over in minutes, but it marked a turning point. Montrose, alone and thousands of miles from home, had stood between an armed power and a civilian vessel. She had done so not with overwhelming might, but with clarity of purpose and the threat of deadly force if required. That day, HMS Montrose became more than a warship. She became a symbol of deterrence, of discipline, and of the critical role played by naval power in preserving the rules of the sea. Her actions would ripple across news networks, military briefings, and political debates for weeks to come. But the IRGC had not forgotten the Grace 1, and they were not done. The episode with the British Heritage was only the first overt challenge. Iran would bide its time, study British patterns, and strike again, this time with speed, precision, and theatrical defiance. The world would watch once more as the thin gray line of the Royal Navy faced the black flags of the IRGC amid the blazing heat of the Gulf. And HMS Montrose, the lone guardian of the Strait, would be called upon again. The encounter. Shadow in the waves. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky on July 10th, the scene turned tense. 3 IRGC gunboats, sleek and menacing, slipped from Iranian waters. Their design was unmistakable: light, fast, and armed with heavy machine guns and possibly shoulder-fired rockets. They did not transmit identification. They did not respond to hails. Instead, they made straight for British Heritage. Aboard HMS Montrose, sonar operators and radar officers tracked every movement. Tactical officers plotted intercept courses. The command team analyzed options. Commander King issued a series of escalating warnings over radio frequencies, demanding that the gunboats retreat. The Iranian boats pressed on, attempting to maneuver between Montrose and the tanker. Their intent was clear: divert the tanker into Iranian territorial waters, a seizure in retaliation for Grace 1. Commander King gave the order: action stations, weapons free for warning shots. Montrose goes to battle stations. The calm inside HMS Montrose shifted to a tense ballet of trained coordination. Crews rushed to their stations. The 4.5-inch deck gun rotated and locked onto the closest IRGC boat. Missile batteries tracked the others. The ship's Wildcat helicopter was spun up, its crew ready to provide air support or surveillance. With a firm, practiced voice, the British warship issued a direct warning: "If you do not turn away, we will take defensive action. You are endangering the safe navigation of a British-flagged vessel in international waters." The Iranian vessels faltered. For a moment, the sea fell into eerie stillness. Then they surged forward again. In an astonishing act of precision, HMS Montrose maneuvered herself between the gunboats and the tanker. Her deck gun fired a warning burst into the water, well ahead of the IRGC vessels, but close enough to deliver an unmistakable message. This was not a bluff, retreat, and defiance. The IRGC boats, sensing the situation had escalated beyond manageable levels, finally broke off and retreated into Iranian waters. But their movements were recorded, tracked, and immediately relayed back to London and Washington. The British Heritage completed her journey unscathed. In Tehran, fury met frustration. The IRGC vowed to continue defending Iranian interests. But they had been denied an easy propaganda victory that day. In London, Defense Secretary Penny Mordaunt praised the crew of Montrose for their professionalism and courage under pressure. Diplomats braced for what would come next. The world watched, holding its breath. Aftermath and fallout. Just days later, on July 19, 2019, Iran captured the British-flagged Stena Impero, a tanker traveling without escort. Unlike British Heritage, she had no Montrose by her side. Iranian commandos rappelled from helicopters in dramatic fashion, boarding and commandeering the vessel. This tit-for-tat seizure raised tensions to even greater heights. In response, the UK launched Operation Sentinel, part of a US-led maritime coalition aiming to ensure freedom of navigation through the strait. More Royal Navy ships were deployed. The British government also advised all UK-flagged ships to avoid the region without naval escort. What had begun as a diplomatic scuffle over sanctions now became a serious international maritime crisis. Legacy of the incident. The July 10th defense of British Heritage stands as a rare modern example of traditional naval deterrence working flawlessly. A single warship, well commanded and professionally crewed, had stared down multiple hostile vessels, defended international law, and preserved peace, without firing a single hostile shot. In an era of cyber warfare, drones, and asymmetrical conflict, HMS Montrose reminded the world that sometimes a 4.5-inch naval gun and the determination of its crew still mattered. It also sent a clear message to Iran. The Royal Navy may be smaller than in its imperial days, but its will to protect British interests on the high seas remains unshaken. The Persian Gulf remains a hotspot. The geopolitical tectonics in the region shift constantly, but the legacy of July 10, 2019 endures. That narrow sliver of ocean bore witness to a moment when history turned on a thread of steel, when diplomacy stood behind the silent roar of a warship's warning gun, and when the Royal Navy once again earned its centuries-old reputation as the silent guardian of the sea lanes.